I'd like to begin tonight with an apology. Over the weekend, I contracted some kind of sinus cold, and recently I consumed a large blue pill that I think was made for a horse, based on how difficult it was to swallow. The packaging promised that I would feel better. I feel different. I don't know that I feel better. I feel like I'm about an inch off the ground. So I'm going to hang on for dear life to this table, and I would appreciate the grace if I am less than enthusiastic tonight and if I'm not just downright gripping. So we'll do the best we possibly can throughout this evening. In addition to contracting a sinus illness of some kind, this past weekend we celebrated a wedding. It was a family in our church. So James and Emily are married, which is extremely exciting. It deserves a couple woots and some clapping, absolutely. They're affectionately known as the tallest people in our church. So if you're wondering who I'm talking about, you will know them when they come back as the tallest people around. So please extend your congratulations and encouragement to them. This was the first in a long line of weddings that I didn't officiate, and so we had a bit of a different perspective on it than we normally do. And one of the things that became clear in this wedding was that they had paid attention to every detail, which is not surprising. This takes place at like pretty much every wedding you go to these days, and weddings become increasingly more expensive and increasingly more complex. And it made me think a little bit back onto our wedding. We're in our 10th year of marriage, which is exciting. Also deserves some woots and claps, I think. I was thinking back about our wedding. I was like, what do I remember from our wedding, And I remember some things. I remember, some things from the ceremony, some things from the reception. I remember being extremely nervous. I remember Julie being not nervous at all, which was super intimidating. As a person who typically overanalyzes things, I overanalyze the entire experience rather than just, enjoying it. I don't recommend that. But we did have a really great experience, and oftentimes I'll ask people, even this far out from our wedding, what do you remember from our wedding? And two things, and they're not the things you would think, but there are two things that people always remember from our wedding. The first is we served bacon-wrapped fillets at our reception, and there was like 200 and something people there or whatever. And there's one thing that Julie's dad and I agree on, and there's a few things, but this thing probably more than anything else is that food matters. And so we were like, okay, this is the most important. Like, we can cut corners on everything else, but the food will be fantastic. And it sure enough was, and it was memorable enough. Even a decade later, people still talk about it. The second thing was the weather was terrible. It was raining, snowing, sleeting, sideways, wind, and although it was a short walk from the chapel to the reception, it was likely people would get kind of wet or, cold or whatever. So we had purchased a whole bunch of umbrellas for people to kind of go back and forth between the two places. And so at that time, Rihanna's song Umbrella was a pretty cool song. That played at the reception, and everybody had an umbrella, and we're talking like 100 people on the dance floor with umbrellas swinging around, and nobody got stabbed in the face, which was amazing, maybe the most amazing thing that happened that day. But those are the two things people remember. They don't remember who said what in the ceremony. They don't remember who said what in the toasts. They don't remember what color the flowers were. They remember things like that. And it's funny, after all the details and all the planning and all the obsession over this and that and everything else that come along with the wedding and reception, the things that people remember are really quite interesting. But weddings are not unique in the ways that we become obsessed with the details. It is weird to me that we do that right before we make the biggest commitment of our entire lives, but we obsess over details in a variety of different areas of life, right? Like, think about the domains of your life, your work, your family, your leisure time, your church, whatever. We get so obsessed with the little things, and oftentimes in doing so, we miss the big picture. We miss what's really happening around that. And the text that we're going to be in tonight, Jesus has a lot to say about that particular issue, about getting caught in the weeds, caught in the minutia and the details of life, so much so that we miss some of the bigger things that are happening and swirling around. And perhaps in the season of Lent, more than any other time of year, it's really appropriate to take a step back and see what some of the bigger things are, some of the bigger narratives in life that are actually taking place. So Devin's going to come up and read from John chapter 6. We're working our way through John in this season. I'll talk a little bit more about our trajectory for the rest of the series in a moment. Devin, you can go ahead and read John chapter 6, 1 through 15.
After this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for all these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than a half year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him a king by force, withdrew to a mountain by himself. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. This is the only miracle story that takes place across all 4 Gospels. So the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, typically have a lot of things in common, and they're synoptic, in fact. So there's a lot of similarities from one to the other. But John is this outlier. It's kind of like a bunch of stories that aren't recorded in the other ones. Stephen actually gave us a list on a slide last week that showed us some of the things that John leaves out and puts a bunch of other things in their place. But this particular miracle story appears in all 4 Gospels. And it's an amazing story. So Jesus is kind of trying to get away by himself, and these people had seen him heal person after person. We're talking like sick people, people who have disabilities, people who are injured, and Jesus is healing them left and right. And this crowd catches on to this. Like, this guy knows how to heal people. That's amazing. We should go see what else he can do. I mean, you would do the same thing, right? If you saw somebody heal people over and over and over again, you'd probably follow them around for a little bit, or at least like kind of pay attention to what was going on. Especially if you were, maybe you had time. Like maybe these people were unemployed. Maybe these people, for whatever reason, were on a journey. Maybe for some reason, they had space and time to follow him and watch what he was doing. And so he goes, and these people come in droves, and it happens to be at a time in which they were supposed to eat. And so these people are hungry. And it's a really simple, I mean, I don't know that there's any like major metaphor there or anything for us to gain from. They were just like simply hungry, like their stomachs were growling, and they needed to eat. And so Jesus, knowing full well what he's going to do, looks to Philip and is like, "Hey, what do you think we should do?" You know, like he knows what he's going to do, but he asks anyways. And Philip is kind of calculating. He's sort of the one who maybe kept the books, and he decides, doing some quick math in his head, that it would take half a year's wage in order to give every person about a bite. There's 5,000 men, and in that time it wasn't uncommon to only count the adult men, and so there were probably somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people, women and children included. So we're talking a huge crowd, like slightly bigger than our church, right? In this huge field, and Jesus is like, "What do you think we should do? What do we think we should? How should we feed these people?" Again, knowing full well what he's going to do. And so they decide, Andrew at least decides to say, "Hey, this kid's got some food," which I think if anybody was sitting around and listening to that, they probably laughed at him, because it's kind of insane to think there are between 5,000 and 10,000 hungry people here, and we're going to take this kid's lunch bag and pass it around. That's a ridiculous assumption that would actually work. And Jesus goes, "Yeah, let's take that. Let's pray for it, and then let's pass it around. And let's make sure everybody gets as much as they want." So it's not like everybody gets to tear off a little bit, or everybody gets like just enough to like satisfy their desperate hunger, but everybody gets to eat as much as they want. And they pass this around, and in the end, there's leftovers. Not just like what was already there, but more and more baskets and baskets are collected in the leftovers. And it's an amazing story. It's one of the most well-known miracle stories of Jesus. And if we stopped there and just left it be as it is, it would be an amazing story. And it would actually be worth us singing songs about tonight. It would be worth us praying prayers about. It'd be worth us considering tomorrow, what does it look like for us to follow the way of Jesus when he can do this? It's worth it, just at face value as it is. But in true John fashion, there's way more to the story than that. And the rest of the story, the layers that make this story what it is, and really the entirety of chapter 6 are found in one verse. At the very beginning, in verse 4. In verse 4, it says that the Passover was at hand. The Passover festival was at hand. And it seems like a brief mention, and there's so much more to the story that it's really easy to blow past that and think about everything else that happens. And by the end of the story, we're so amazed that we forget to go back up to the top. And we surely don't go back to the top when we're reading through the rest of John 6 and hear the other amazing stories about Jesus walking on water, for instance. We don't think about that one verse. But what John is doing, like he does in so many other parts of his gospel, is he's tying something that Jesus did to a way bigger story, to a way bigger narrative. Stephen talked about it last week when he talked about Sabbath. You're going to hear about it in the coming weeks in other John stories about Jesus connecting what he's doing to something that's way, way bigger. So Jesus is with these people, and he's giving them food. But at the beginning, it's made note that this is the Passover meal. This is around the time of the Passover. And so that begs the question, or that's not the proper way to use that. That sort of like forces us to ask the question, I should say, or what is Passover? Like, what is that feast? What is that festival? What is the point? And if you go all the way back into your Old Testament, actually kind of towards the beginning in the book of Exodus, there's a story about Passover. And it launched this tradition and this rhythm among the Jewish people that is still in place today. A Passover meal was to be taken a part in and enjoyed regularly. Yearly, they would take part in this meal, this Passover meal. What did it represent? Well, it's not very cleverly named. I mean, the Passover meal is about a passing over. And so the Jewish people, imagine this, are enslaved, completely enslaved by Pharaoh and the Egyptian people. For generations, they are the slaves. They are the oppressed people of the Egyptians. They have to work and do whatever the Egyptians ask them to do with very little to no pay and very to little no compensation. And Moses shows up on the scene, and God speaks to Moses and says, hey, you have to tell Pharaoh to let these people go because they're my people and I don't want them to be enslaved anymore. So Moses, time after time, goes to Pharaoh. Finally, towards the end, after Pharaoh has said yes and then no over and over and over again, there's one final way God gets Pharaoh to let his people go. And that is through the Passover. And so after plagues like locusts and gnats and frogs and a bunch of other terrible things that took place, God finally says the Spirit is going to move through the entire land of Egypt. And in doing so, he's going to kill the firstborn male of every single Egyptian household. And we don't have time, nor do I have the understanding to explain why that's okay. You should know that it bothers me, by the way, that like God would send his Spirit to kill the firstborn male child of every single household. We don't have time to go into that, but I realized as I was studying this week that my discomfort with it is because I read this from a perspective of privilege. See, when an oppressed people, or people who haven't experienced privilege, or people who have experienced injustice over injustice over injustice, and enslaved people, in fact, read this story, they go, right on. Those people got out of there. That enslaved, oppressed group of people were liberated by God. Thanks be to God. I in a position of privilege, I'm all worried about the philosophy and theology of the fact that God sent his Spirit to kill the firstborn of every family in Egypt, but an oppressed people wouldn't have read it this way, and they don't read it this way. And oppressed people read that story in Exodus and they go, right on. That's great that the people of God were liberated because they were oppressed, and now they are liberated. And so sure enough, God's final act to the Egyptian people, it's the last straw. And Pharaoh says, go, get out of here. And they call that experience the Passover because as the Spirit of God was moving through the land of Egypt, he passed over the homes that had lamb's blood on the doorframe, which indicated that they were Israelite people. He passed over them. So for the people of God, to celebrate Passover was to celebrate liberation. It was to celebrate salvation. It was to celebrate being oppressed at one time and then being freed from that oppression. So when John writes at the beginning of the story, Passover was at hand. They were talking about a time of year where they were remembering that they were once slaves and they were no longer. They were once under the oppressive rule of Egypt and they were no longer under that oppressive rule any longer. And so Jesus performs this miracle in this time, and it's specific to that time for a very good reason. The purpose of this miracle and when he performs it and how he performs it is to show that once again, God is providing for the immediate needs of his people. I believe that Jesus is saying overall in this story that he is, in fact, God. He's doing this, and the parallels throughout John 6 are incredible, where he parallels something that God did in the Old Testament. And in doing so, as Stephen said last week, he's saying, I'm God. It's a very theological statement that he's making. But he says three particular things that I want to draw our attention to. In meeting the immediate hunger needs of the people in that field, Jesus says, I can and will meet your immediate needs. I can and will. That's the face value version of that miracle, by the way. Like, again, if we left here tonight, we're like, that's really great. Some really cool stuff happened in a field, and they ate bread and fish. God meets the needs of his people, period. And that may be what you needed to hear tonight. That may be what I needed to hear tonight, is that God meets your immediate needs. He can do that, and he will do that. But there's more. Because it takes place in the time of Passover, because of the timing of the event, God is saying through the actions of Jesus, I am not done yet. I provided then, and I'm going to provide now, and I'm going to keep providing. I do this over and over and over again for my people. This wasn't a one-time event when I passed over my people in Egypt. This wasn't a one-time event when I provided manna from heaven. This wasn't a one-time event when Moses got the law on the top of Mount Sinai. This wasn't a one-time event when they crossed the Jordan and went into the promised land. This wasn't a one-time event when this happened and that happened and the next thing happened. This is going to keep happening. God is not done yet. He's going to continue to provide for his people. So we are so self-sufficient in 2018. There's so many things that do things for us or that we do for ourselves. There are so many things that preemptively make decisions for you. The advertisements that you see or the interactions that you have, there is less and less happenstance than there used to be. Things are calculated more and more now than they've ever been. And yet in a time of self-sufficiency, in a time where we believe that we can accomplish anything and that anything can be accomplished for us, God is saying, no, I'm the one who meets your needs, and I'm not done yet. I'm going to keep doing that over and over again. The third thing that Jesus says in this action is the best is yet to come. At the end of the meal, there wasn't just like barely some crumbs on the ground. I mean, he didn't just provide for everyone. There were baskets and baskets and baskets of leftovers. And later on in chapter 6, Jesus says, I am the bread of life. All a foreshadowing to this Last Supper experience where he takes bread and he breaks it. He says, this is my body broken for you, only for a day later for him to be crucified, give his literal physical body to be killed so that he could give himself for us. The best is yet to come. Not just in the leftovers, like, oh, we have lots of leftover food. Like, I mean, Cafe 180 gave us a ton of food last week for a community dinner, and it was amazing, and the Hoags are still, like, trifling through it because there's a ton of food there. That's really great. But the best is yet to come, meaning, like, the leftovers are going to keep getting better, if you can imagine. Leftovers don't do that. Leftovers get worse over time, right? They get weird and moldy, and they change colors. Jesus is saying, like, there was leftovers, and still the best is yet to come. The leftovers are going to keep getting better, because I am going to give myself for my people. In this action, because of the timing and because of the wording around it, John brilliantly paints a picture for us and continues to do so throughout the rest of chapter 6. God's saying this, I can and will meet your needs. I am not done yet, and the best is yet to come. It's extremely easy for us to get bogged down in the immediate details. In that moment, the 5,000 plus people who were in that field were thinking one thing, which was, I'm hungry. Maybe this might just be a me thing, but when I'm hungry, it's game over. Like, I can't do anything else. I mean, I can't really focus on anything, can't have a conversation. Julie keeps snacks for me and the kids in the diaper bag because I need to have those around. It's important for me to, like, be full, right? And you need that too. We get bogged down, but I'm tired, I'm bored, I'm hungry, I'm busy, I'm distracted. Whatever I am, whatever the immediate detail is right now, we get bogged down in that, and we forget to see that there is, in fact, a much bigger thing taking place. And in the season of Lent, we strip away a lot, don't we? Many of you have practiced giving up or taking up, abstaining from something and maybe taking up a new practice to create space so that you can hear God speak and act. And my guess is during this time of Lent, we're far enough in that you felt a bit of that, the sting of scarcity. You felt that moment where you're like, I really want that thing that I decided I wasn't going to have. The first week was pretty good. We're into week 2 and 3 and then 4, and it gets hard because you really want that thing, whatever that thing is. And it's in the sting of scarcity that we remember that God is doing a lot more than just what our immediate desire is, our immediate need. In this story, Jesus is saying far more than I can meet your immediate needs. Although he is saying that, he's also saying I'm not done yet, and the best is yet to come. There's nothing better for zooming out and seeing maybe more to what is to this life than a funeral. I don't know if you've been to a funeral recently. Maybe you've never been to a funeral. I don't know. But this past week, I performed a funeral for David Henderson, who was for 38 years on staff with the city of Inglewood in the Public Works Department. He's a personal friend of the city manager. He made maybe more of an impact on the city than just about anybody who's ever been on staff with the city, and like nobody knew it because it's public works. It's literally the piping below us. It's the street. It's the sidewalk. It's buildings that we go to every single day and we pass by every single day and we don't even know. He was one of the leaders who designed and began construction on what we call our city hall now. He was one of the leaders behind the design and the construction of the police building headquarters that's being built literally as we sit here. It's under construction right now. He died the day before they broke ground. I didn't know the man. I've never met him, but I got the opportunity to learn about him vicariously by interviewing other people and asking questions. What was he like? What was he about? And as much as he cared about the details of the city, and as much as he, just like you and I, got bogged down in the minutia of the moment, the things that remained, the things that came up in his service were things like integrity and character and friendship and sacrifice. These are the things that remained at the end of his life. And there's nothing like a funeral to make you zoom out and step back for a second and go, maybe there's more going on here than whatever fire I'm trying to put out right now. Last weekend, Julie was in New York City for 5 days, and I had the kids to myself, which was survival at best, I think is the best way to say that. You all were very incredible, by the way, in the ways that you gave up time and resources to help me manage my family, both the community dinner and beyond that. It was amazing, so thank you. It was great to have a church family come around us in that way. But I was so busy going from one crisis to the next just to keep us all alive and the house from burning down, that I kept losing sight of the fact that I was a dad and I was parenting these little kids, all of whom I've prayed for and begged God for. I'd missed that. And more than once, my 2-year-old Lucy looked at me and said, "Be sweet to us, Daddy." Which is like soul crushing, right? You're like, "God, okay." So it was probably a moment of like aggression, or I was like raising my voice or something. And I was like, "Yes, you're so right." And I had to take a minute to be like, man, I am being a total jerk. And these are my kids who I love. And it doesn't mean that they're great all the time. It doesn't mean that we don't have issues and we were always going to fight through those things. But there were a couple moments last weekend where I was so caught in the weeds of the moment and trying to put out one fire after another, that but because of something that happened or something one of my kids said, I was able to zoom out and just be like, this is my greatest joy, to be a dad to these 3 little ones. It's my greatest joy. And there's some things that happen here on Sunday nights where like, this isn't happening right, or that's not happening right, or that light's not on right now and it's bugging me. Like it's so easy to get completely bogged down in those things. But this is my church and you are my people and I care about you and I love you. And I have rearranged my life to care for you and to care about you. And I don't mean that in like a self-sacrificial, like messianic sort of way. Like it's not that great. I just mean I care about you enough to change the way my life and my family's life is moving. The trajectory of our life is different because we've chosen to love you and love this community and to receive your love to us, by the way. It's so easy to get bogged down in the details of life, but in this story, if there's anything that Jesus is saying, he's saying there's a lot more going on. The best is yet to come. I'm not done yet. I'm going to keep providing for you. I'm going to keep caring for you. I'm going to keep loving you. He does that by pointing us back to the Passover meal, but he does it in all the details of the story and throughout the rest of the chapter. And he's going to continue to do, John is going to continue to tell that story and narrative of Jesus throughout the rest of this series, and I'm excited for you to hear the rest of it. My hope for you is that during the season of Lent, as you zoom out and to get moments of space, margin, where there's nothing scheduled or nothing planned, where you can listen and hear from God. My hope is that during those times, you will get a different picture and a different perspective on all the things that God is doing. God can and will meet your immediate needs. God is not done yet, and the best is yet to come. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, thanks for these stories that tell us so much more when we dig deeper than they do at face value. Thank you for meeting my immediate needs over and over and over again. I think that I make a living, and I think that I accomplish things, and I think so often that I am the one pulling the levers, but God, you are the one who provides. And I ask for your forgiveness for the times where I think it is me, and I pray, God, that you would help us to regularly confess the supposed sovereignty that we regularly take on. I pray, God, that in Lent that we would see that you are providing for us. You're not done yet, and that the best is yet to come. Pray these things in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.